All right, everyone, welcome back. We're picking up where we left off on our deep dive into modern Indian history. This time we're going to be focusing on something really crucial, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC GS1, and that is the socio-religious reform movements that kind of swept across 19th century India.
Yeah. Last time we talked about British rule, the politics, the economics, all that, but now we're shifting gears a little bit to understand the social and religious landscape and the push for reform that happened during that same period.
So let's set the stage a bit. Imagine India back in the 1800s. What was the social scene like? What were the big issues that kind of sparked this whole need for reform?
Well, think of it this way. India at that time was dealing with a lot of really deep-rooted social norms and practices that people were starting to see as really unjust, really outdated.
So it's like not just abstract debates, right? We're talking real life stuff,
Yeah.
real consequences for people.
Exactly. Yeah. Think of something like sati, for example, the forced, immolation of widows, which was a very real and tragic thing for many women. And of course, we know figures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy really bravely challenged that and fought against it. His work, it was instrumental in getting sati abolished. That's a major turning point.
Wow. It's honestly hard to imagine something like that happening today, but it's also incredible to see these individuals standing up and saying no to these injustices.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just him, right? I mean, there are others. Who else emerged during this period?
No, absolutely. You had a whole bunch of remarkable individuals really dedicated their lives to this idea of social reform. And each of them kind of took on a different piece of this, prevailing social order, advocating for change, pushing for progress.
So who are some of the big names, some of the key players? Give us the highlights. What did they contribute?
Well, you can't talk about social reform without bringing up, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. He was like such a strong advocate for women's education, and his work was key in legalizing widow remarriage, a real champion for challenging those patriarchal norms that were so deeply entrenched in society.
Yeah. Vidyasagar's work, that's huge.
Yeah.
Were there others who focused more on the religious side of things?
Absolutely. You had someone like Swami Vivekananda. He emphasized universalism, social service. He presented a much more inclusive view of Hinduism, one that resonated not just in India, but also globally.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. Taking it to the global stage, challenging stereotypes, I bet.
Hmm.
Seems like this period was just full of these reformers, all from different backgrounds, all with different approaches.
Yeah, it was a very dynamic time. And, we can't forget Dayanand Saraswati. He advocated for going back to the Vedic scriptures, challenging those traditional interpretations of Hinduism. He wanted a more rational, simplified approach to religion.
So all these reformers working towards a better society, but taking very different paths to get there. But it wasn't just big names and debates, right? What were the actual, specific social problems they were fighting against? What were they trying to change?
Oh, they were tackling a whole range of social issues. Dowry, sex-based injustice, child marriage, that whole Purdah system.
Hmm.
All these practices came under scrutiny and criticism.
Okay, break it down for us. Can you give us a real example of how these things played out in everyday life? I think it would help everyone listening, especially for the UPSC folks, to understand just how bad these practices were.
Imagine a young girl, barely a teenager, being forced into marriage, often with someone much older. That was the reality for countless girls under child marriage. Not only did it rob them of their childhood, but it also had severe consequences for their health, their education, their entire well-being.
That's just heartbreaking. So clearly these reformers had a lot on their plate. How did they go about making changes? Were they mostly focused on changing the laws?
Well, yeah, legal reforms were a big part of it, for sure. But they also knew that changing laws alone wasn't enough. They needed to change minds to challenge these deep-rooted social norms.
So how do they reach people, get their message out there?
Well, they were pretty innovative. They started using vernacular languages, the languages people actually spoke, to reach the masses, bypassing the elite, really connecting at a grassroots level.
Smart. It makes sense. If you want to make change, you have to speak the people's language. But it wasn't just talking, was it? What else did they do?
Oh, yeah, they totally understood the power of communication. They used literature, plays, even the press. Think of it like the social media of the 19th century. Through these platforms, they were able to spread their ideas and challenge the status quo.
Wow. Ahead of their time. So all this effort, did it actually work? Did they make a real impact?
Well, the impact of these movements was definitely mixed. Yeah, some positive changes, but also some unintended consequences. It's really important to understand both sides to really get their legacy.
Okay, let's start with the good stuff. What were some of the wins? What did they achieve?
Well, one of the biggest things was that they significantly improved the position of women in society. We saw real legal changes, things like the ban on sati and infanticide, the Widow Remarriage Act, and the Sharda Act, which was aimed at stopping child marriage.
So they weren't just raising awareness, they were getting things done, pushing through laws. That's pretty awesome. But you mentioned some unintended consequences. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so while they were advocating for all these progressive ideas, their main audience was often the educated urban middle class. The vast majority of people, especially in rural areas, were often left out of these reforms.
So even with all their efforts, their reach was limited. What other unintended consequences were there?
Well, one thing is that in their efforts to revive and glorify India's ancient past, to instill this sense of pride, they sometimes ended up promoting a kind of pseudo-scientific thinking.
Oh, interesting. So while pushing for progress on one hand, they were kind of clinging to certain aspects of the past that may not have been helpful for scientific advancement.
Exactly. Yeah, it's complex for sure. And, while they were all about unity and a better society, their focus on specific religious identities and interpretations sometimes, well, it actually made existing divisions between religious groups worse.
Like a paradox, right?
Yeah.
Good intentions, but the outcomes weren't always straightforward. Makes you think, what was the lasting legacy of this whole era?
That's the million-dollar question. It's complex for sure. But, even with those limitations, these movements were really important. They set the stage for a lot of the social and political reforms that we see in India today. They're woven into the fabric of modern India.
So it wasn't just about immediate change. It was about laying the groundwork for a more just and equitable future, right?
Precisely. Yeah. They sparked those conversations, challenged those norms, and they basically created a foundation for future generations to continue that fight for social justice and equality.
Their legacy lives on, inspiring us even today.
Absolutely. It's like a reminder that creating a better society is a journey. It never really ends. And their dedication, it's like a guiding light for anyone who wants to make a difference.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's break down these movements a little more. Stay with us as we take a deeper dive into the specific impacts and long-lasting legacies of these socio-religious reforms, coming up in part 2. And hey, if you're finding this deep dive helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your friends. We'll be back in a jiffy.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, remember we were talking about the impact of these reform movements, right? Kind of mixed bag, some good, some not so good, some unexpected outcomes. It's complicated, right?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's a really good point you made earlier about history not being this straight line, this A to B thing. It's all these interconnected events and their long-term effects. And I think for our listeners, especially those getting ready for those UPSC exams, being able to analyze that complexity, that's super important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. UPSC isn't just about knowing facts, it's about understanding those connections and being able to think critically. So let's take a step back here for a second and think about why these movements, from centuries ago, should matter to anyone listening today.
Right, because it's easy to think of history as this, irrelevant thing, but that's just not true.
Exactly. And these movements, they're like the perfect example of how ideas and actions, they can have this ripple effect. They shape the present, even centuries later. Think about the things we're talking about today, gender equality, social justice, religious freedom. Those debates, a lot of those go straight back to those struggles in the 19th century.
So it's like those ripples you talked about. They're still hitting us,
Yeah.
right? We're still dealing with some of the same fundamental issues that they were grappling with back then.
Exactly. So by understanding their struggles, their victories, even their mistakes, it gives us this valuable perspective on how societies try to deal with these deep-rooted problems and work towards, positive change.
Right. Yeah, it's not just about, memorizing names and dates, but understanding why things happen, what motivated people, and what were those long-term effects.
Right, exactly. So let's zoom in on that legacy a bit. How did these socio-religious reforms really leave their mark on India today? What can we see?
Well, I mean, their fingerprints are everywhere, right? Our laws, our institutions, even our social norms. So much of it traces back to these movements. Take the fight for women's rights, for example. That's obviously an ongoing struggle. But those reformers back then, they laid a crucial foundation.
Think about the Sharda Act, aimed at preventing child marriage. That came directly from the efforts of those reformers. And sure, child marriage still exists today, sadly. But the Sharda Act, that was a huge step forward. And it paved the way for other legal reforms to protect women and girls.
Right, so it's like a relay race.
Right.
The fight didn't begin or end in the 19th century, but these movements were vital in pushing things forward, shifting the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And another big piece of their legacy is this emphasis on education, especially for women, as a driver of change and empowerment. Many reformers saw that as like the key to unlocking progress.
And you can see how that idea, the power of education, is still so central to India's social policies today.
Yeah. And it's not just legal and educational, right? Their influence is also in how we talk about religion today. They challenged those really rigid interpretations of scriptures and promoted more like inclusive and humanistic approaches to faith.
It's interesting. They really weren't afraid to criticize religious practices, to challenge those norms, even within their own faiths.
Right, exactly. They started these conversations about the role of religion, its relationship to social justice. And those conversations, they're still going on today, even as religion remains, this complex and often controversial thing in India.
So if we were to kind of summarize, what are the key takeaways, especially for our UPSC listeners? What are those crucial things to remember about these movements?
Okay, so first, remember that context is everything. Don't think of these reform movements as isolated things. They were totally intertwined with everything else that was happening in India under British rule. The politics, the economics, the anxieties of the time.
Right, so understanding that big picture is key.
Exactly. And secondly, remember they weren't just one big homogenous movement. There was this huge diversity of reformers, all with their own perspectives, different ways of doing things. Some focused on religious reform, some on social issues, but they all wanted the same thing, a more just and equal society.
Right, it's like change comes from many voices, not just one single leader.
Exactly. And lastly, remember that even though they made a lot of progress, they also had limitations, and sometimes their actions had these unintended consequences. It's important to recognize that, to see both the good and the bad.
Yeah, because change is rarely neat and clean, right? It's messy, it's complex. But their efforts, it's a reminder that even when it's hard, it's worth fighting for. It's about always trying to build a better future, even if it means going against what's considered normal at the time.
Exactly. And for our UPSC friends, being able to grasp those nuances, the context, the different players, the complexities, that's what's going to help you write those amazing, insightful answers.
It's about analysis, thinking critically, understanding those connections, not just, spitting out facts.
Right. Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more piece we need to look at. These reform movements, they weren't just about the past. They also bring up these really important questions about India today,
Oh, interesting. So stay tuned, folks, because we're going to unpack that, the relevance of these movements for contemporary India right after this.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've been talking about these socio-religious reform movements, right? Their successes, their failures, the impact they had, all of that. But I think now we need to kind of connect the dots, bring it all back to today. How does all this stuff from the 19th century, how does that relate to India now?
And that's where it gets really interesting, because these reformers weren't just dealing with like the issues of their time. They were tackling these really fundamental questions, like questions about social justice, individual rights, the role of tradition in a society that's changing really fast.
And those themes, those are still so relevant in India today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think about all the debates we have now about gender equality, religious freedom, caste, those issues. They have really deep roots. And understanding these reform movements, I think it helps us to see those connections.
But knowing the past helps us to make sense of the present.
Yeah, precisely. For example, have you ever heard of the concept of hypergamy? It was a big thing in 19th century India. Basically, it's this practice where women would marry men of a higher social status, which, often reinforced those caste hierarchies and limited women's choices.
Hypergamy. Honestly, I'm not familiar with that. Can you tell us a little more about how it worked back then and maybe how it connects to Indian society today?
Yeah, sure. So hypergamy, it was often tied to the whole dowry system, where the bride's family would have to give a lot of wealth to the groom's family. And that created this economic incentive for families to marry their daughters up the social ladder, so to speak.
So it wasn't just about social status, but also economics, right?
Exactly. And even though dowry is illegal in India now, you can still see some traces of that system in, certain marriage customs and expectations. It's fascinating, really.
Yeah, those old patterns are still kind of lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. And the reformers, they really understood how all this stuff was interconnected, the social customs, the economic structures, even religious beliefs. They knew that real change had to happen on all those different levels.
So, thinking about all this, what are the lessons we can learn from these reformers, especially as we face our own challenges today?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is just their courage, their willingness to challenge the status quo. They didn't shy away from questioning those traditional practices, even when it meant going up against powerful people and deeply held beliefs.
And that kind of courage, I mean, we need that now more than ever.
Absolutely. But it wasn't just about being rebellious for the sake of it. They were strategic.
Yeah.
They used education, they used the press, even the legal system to push for change.
Like they used all the tools they had, right?
Exactly. And that's a lesson for us too. We need to adapt our strategies, use the tools we have, whether it's social media, technology, all that.
So it's like learn from the past, but don't be stuck in it. Take that spirit of reform and apply it to the problems we have now.
Exactly. And just like those reformers faced setbacks and, things didn't always go as planned, we're going to face challenges too. But their dedication, their persistence, that's what inspires us to keep going, even when it's tough.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that change, it's a long road and it's not always easy, but it's a road worth traveling.
And that's why it's so important to really understand this period of Indian history. It's not just about passing an exam. It's about empowering ourselves to actually make a difference, to help create a more just and equitable India.
Well said. And on that note, a huge thanks to our expert for joining us today and sharing all this incredible insight into such a fascinating and relevant part of Indian history. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Always happy to talk about history and how it connects to our lives today.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new, maybe got inspired to explore this topic more on your own, and hey, maybe even had some thought-provoking conversations along the way.
Remember, learning, exploring, questioning, it never stops. There's always something new to discover.
And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. We'll be back soon with another exciting topic to explore, so until then, keep those brains buzzing.